All right. Welcome, everyone, to our February community call. Thanks for joining us. For those of you that are tuning in and are unfamiliar with Brand Pollinators or are new to our community calls, Brand Pollinators is a conscientious consulting firm, and we work with emerging purpose-driven brands and founders all over the country, and we help them scale from one stage of growth to the next. Our goal is to bring clarity to your mission and vision and make sure that those values are being actualized and represented in the market. One of the things that we do is we host a monthly community call where we bring in an expert to discuss a topic or a theme that a lot of our founders in our community are dealing with. And so in today's call, we have an excellent guest, and I'm excited to introduce him to you all. We'll be talking about the power of podcasting. So we'll be talking about some of the challenges and some of the benefits of podcasting and just learning about the platform in general. And of course, how to tell a good story through podcasting. So we'll be talking about all of those questions and so many more. But before I introduce our guest, I'll pass it off to Kate Fossen, who is a co-founder here at Brand Pollinators.
Thanks, Channing. So excited to have you all here today, and definitely a hot topic with podcasting. People are really interested in learning more about being a good guest and hosting. So we're going to get into that with Jeff. Jeff Bond is our guest today. He's the CEO and executive producer of Chat with Leaders Media. It's an Atlanta-based production agency on a mission to help purpose-driven business leaders launch their own podcast, cultivate authentic relationships with stakeholders, grow revenue, reduce attrition, and maximize their capacity towards social impact. Jeff serves on the leadership team of the Conscious Capitalism Atlanta chapter and works closely with the Be Local Georgia chapter as a strategic partner. Jeff has been committed to serving others through his 17 plus years of service in marketing, technology, staffing, career development, and content production. So Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today.
It is my pleasure. It's such an honor. I love your conscientious approach to business and how you support purpose-driven business leaders and those that are using influence in business as a force for good, which is why I do what I do as well. So it couldn't be a better opportunity to collaborate with you all.
For sure. And I know a lot of the people in our community, I mean, everyone in our community is geared around this same focus of being purpose driven. So I think it's a great match. So to get into the topic of podcasting, why are we talking about this? Like, why should brands care about podcasting?
Yeah, so you brought up a word that's really resonant with me, and I think is with a lot of people these days, is how do I build a community? I've heard people say before, if you don't have community, you're just a commodity. I've also heard that you can't spell community without the word unity. I'm a big believer that we have been created on this earth for one another. In this time of physical distancing over the last couple of years. And really, I wish it was called physical distancing and not social distancing, because we have had the opportunity to remain more spiritually, socially connected, more so than ever, through the use of technology, storytelling, relationships, and building community through that. And I can honestly say over the last 2 years of podcasting, I have never felt like I've had a stronger community of influence. And this is coming from somebody who's been in sales and marketing his entire career and has made it a very concerted effort to network with people. I have found it to be the best way to instantly connect with anybody that I most want to know, create content with them, for them, shine a spotlight on others that are having a direct impact on my business, my influence, my ability to serve and scale impact. And so I think a lot of people are looking at podcasts today as a form of content-based marketing, how to connect with their ideal customers, their economic buyer personas, to build an audience and to use their influence in some way, hopefully as a force for good. Which is what we like to support here at Chat with Leaders. But I think it's definitely a hot topic everywhere I go now, and I talk to people about what they're doing to continue on, press ahead faithfully, drive sales, drive marketing, create content, stay relevant, stay connected, build relationships. They're all curious about the power of podcasting. And so I love the theme for the show today. And I think that's ultimately why we're here talking about it.
Yeah, for sure. It can definitely be powerful. But what are like the challenges that come along with that? Because obviously it's not just like you just start a podcast and you're good to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think coming up with your initial premise and idea and your why behind doing a podcast, not doing anything just for the sake of it. I often find if there's this kind of burning desire or purpose or passion, and you have all these ideas for content collaboration in your mind, and it's keeping you up at night, that's when you should probably start thinking about creating a podcast. But really the challenge is, how do I execute it? Where do I start? How much time do I need to invest? How much time do I have? A lot of people are struggling with any margin of time in their lives, in their professional lives, let alone their personal family lives, which is why we do what we do. We want to be more present in their lives. So where do I start, and how do I invest the time, which is usually the first kind of idea of scarcity that creeps into our minds. The other one is how many resources, how do I monetize it and make it sustainable so that I can afford to keep going? And then lastly, just any sort of self-limiting beliefs that we might have about our own selves and our own ability to create content that people care about. And why should that matter in the first place, right? So starting to get into that self-doubt mode of, will people actually care, listen, or will it be significant in any sort of way? I think if you can get past that self-limiting belief and just start, that's a wise place to be if you finally, convince yourself that you're going to do it.
Yeah. And I mean, there's millions of podcasts out there. So how do you know, I mean, how do you stand out, or how do you separate yourself in such a flooded marketplace?
Yeah. So first question, right, for everybody. I mean, how many people in this room are avid listeners of podcasts? Do you listen to a lot of podcasts?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Has anyone started a podcast in this room by a show of hands? Nathan, JV, you haven't. Kate, you haven't.
No.
Channing, you haven't. But you're avid listeners. Is there a platform that you're trying to create for your business and trying to spread influence by a show of hands? I think everybody, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I think ultimately it's, if you're thinking about, podcasting, where do I start? How do I compete? It's coming up with, what is your platform? What is your unique voice and message? And when you think about your business, that's a best place to start, especially for a business to business brand, or B2B as people call it, right? Is if you're looking to connect with the stakeholders that have the most significant impact on your growth of revenue, and we're all taught to find a way to create value for that group of stakeholders before we ask for any sort of sale. I'm sure you've all heard that traditional wisdom. I know, time and time again. But how do you actually provide that value for them? It's not just leaving it to chance that they're going to knock on your door one day and say, hey, I'm interested in your service. I mean, there's so much noise out there. You can't just go and meet someone at a networking event as easily as you used to. You could research them to death and reach out and send them a gift and do all these other things, or you could reach out and create content with them and say, listen, I've created a platform that specifically, let's just say you target CEOs in your business only, and I've created a show that highlights remarkable CEOs in the Atlanta community or whatever city you live in. And we're focused on this special series around the Great Retention, for instance, or the Great Resignation. I'd love to have you on the show. I think you'd be a great guest. What a great opportunity to invite them on without any sort of, trying to sell to them or asking for 15 minutes of their time. to collaborate and to provide something of value to them, to their marketing team. So long as your heart posture is, I'm going to invite you on so that I can really shine a bright spotlight on you, not so that I can make myself look good on this platform. So you set up a call with them, you prepare them for what to expect, you structure a planning outline and the questions that you're going to ask them in a recording session, and then you invite them on to another session like this on Zoom or whatever online video platform. You record it. And Channing, you know what I'm talking about. You've been on the show. Nathan, you know what I'm talking about. You've been on the show. Here we are all together collaborating again because we're part of a community. And so it builds friendships with people that you most want to engage with in your business. And so if you're thinking about monetization, how to stand out, focus on the community that you want to build and the relationships that you want to build first, and make that your priority. Don't make it about vanity metrics or how quickly can I get to 10,000 downloads per episode. That stuff will come with your intent and your focus. But focus on the relationships that you want to build first with the right people and the right focused audience.
Yeah, that's great advice. And what if you're on the other side of that as a podcast guest? What if you're not looking to necessarily build your own show, but you want to you want to have more guest opportunities and be on other people's podcasts? What's some advice you have for people in terms of how to tell a good story or how to present yourself when you're a guest?
Yeah. So, first of all, there's lots of booking agencies out there. If that's part of your strategy, if you're an author or a speaker, or you're trying to evangelize a certain message out there, you could hire those types of agencies. There are also websites that allow you to go on and match yourself to various podcasts. I know, Nathan, you've done a great job with that. You've spoken on podcasts all around the world. And you're just getting started with a lot of your content. I mean, you built a community here in Atlanta, and you're working on creating more content, and so you can build your own thought leadership through these shows and being strategic about booking yourself. I think it's good to know what your unique voice and story is. So building a speaker sheet, for instance, a lot of people will have a thing on like the topics that they like to talk about, and knowing what they are so that you're staying true to yourself, true to your voice, true to your message, and that it makes it easier for those agencies or those websites, algorithms, or even yourself to identify, is this the right opportunity for me to come on a platform and speak to it? And, the more the better, but just, pace yourself and figure out how many opportunities you can get to speak in situations like this, in situations like you're on a podcast, or if you're up on a stage, or you're part of a conference, or you're part of a small community gathering, and record everything that you're doing. I'm not a huge like Gary Vaynerchuk guy, but he talks about like, every company should be a media company first, right? Like record absolutely everything you do, because all of that content can be repurposed into short little micro videos or blog posts or other types of content that you can put into your marketing calendar, put on your website, your newsletters, your social media, and just, build a whole content waterfall from that. So, the more you're speaking and the more you're recording and the less self-analyzation you're doing and getting into your own head of self-doubt and why is what I'm saying matter and nobody wants to hear this anyways. Like if that's not you, then you probably don't need to be out there speaking, right? And that's okay. That's not your thing. But if you are comfortable with creating content and doing it with others and speaking publicly, then make sure you're recording everything that you're doing, because that feeds into your marketing, that feeds into your sales, that feeds into your content library, your owned list of people that go to your website and consume that content or sign up for your newsletter. So that's all the things that I would consider if you're looking to kind of build your own thought leadership through podcasting and speaking opportunities.
Yeah, that's awesome. And one of the things that makes me think of too is like, I've been involved with Toastmasters quite a bit. And that's one thing they always recommend is you record yourself speaking, even, in the days before we were doing so many, virtual events, just record yourself not necessarily for repurposing, but at least so that you can see how you're presenting yourself and you can hear how you're presenting yourself. And I think it's really valuable practice to be able to look back on what's been recorded and maybe see your progress as you go too.
And part of the secret of life, I think, is giving less of a crap what other people think about you. And yes, self-evaluate, try to be a better speaker, try to say less ums and knows and rights and all of that, but just learn as you go and don't be worried about how people are going to perceive it. If they're perceiving it in some way, that means they're consuming it, right? They're listening, and that's a good thing. And you can always get better and iterate. One person that does it really well out there is a guy named Chris Walker with Refine Media, Refine Labs. One of the others name's Chris Walker. Look him up on LinkedIn. But every time he does a webinar or a podcast, whether he's a host or a guest or some sort of conference, he's always recording it. And I know that he has a big production team behind him, so they do a lot of this, but they always come up with these micro videos that are like 6 minutes, 5 minutes, 8 minutes sometimes. And it's just covering one big idea about demand generation, attribution modeling, marketing, content-based networking, all this stuff that he's a thought leader in, right? And he's established his thought leadership because he is putting out all of this content. But what he's doing is he's speaking on the normal webinar. And like me, I have my phone up here recording me on a separate local device with a lav mic, and I can use this content. I don't have the whole production team that he has, maybe one day, but capture that content because it's stuff that can be used. We're often scratching our brain of like, how do we come up with original content for our marketing calendar? And how do we schedule a regular drip to our audience and provide value to them? Well, if you're already talking about it, record all of that. And that can be reverse engineered into blog posts and other types of content that you're creating, graphics, quotes, audiograms, video clips, tons of stuff that you can do in little chunks to slice it up and to get it out there. So it's the value of speaking. It's the value of being part of a community. It's a value of pouring in to others and giving them value versus just trying to show up and sell yourself or pour in. Nobody likes that type of person anyways, where they're constantly just trying to self-promote. So come in, pour into others, show up in the places like this where people hang out and they gather and they share ideas and they build community and fellowship with one another, and treat everything as a way to add more value to your community and create that content. So as you're speaking, building that thought leadership, just keep all that in mind, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So if there's brand, like we have a lot of CPG brands in our community that have a product or especially like a food product. So if somebody from that industry wanted to start a podcast or even guest on a podcast, what are some like themes that they should be talking about or themes that they should be avoiding? I mean, if you don't want to be constantly just like selling your product, right? Like what are some advice you have about kind of telling that story, or what are some of the topics that they might want to consider?
So quick rule of thumb, share who you have, not what you have. If you're thinking about all of the stakeholders that impact your business as a CPG, you got suppliers, vendors, you got people you sell to, the consumers, you got all sorts of stakeholders that directly have an impact on your revenue. And so how do you tell their stories versus your own? How do you bring them into a platform that talks about just the depths of how they've gone through COVID or how they've navigated their product life cycle, how they navigated themselves as a supply chain business, or and bring them on and just talk about their leadership and their stories and their obstacles that they've overcome, and make it a show about them. They're going to value the fact that you are building a relationship with them and giving them content that they can then go out and market for themselves and for their own brand, while you're building a relationship with them, and you're cultivating an audience, you're cultivating the relationships, and you're making them stronger. So make it about others. Don't make it about your service. Make it about your product. Don't even name the show after your company. I always advise people, like, don't even call it, the company that you are. And of course, I backed into mine, so I called it Chat with Leaders, and then I created the company. So I'm against my own words here, but I know for others, if you're considering it, make it a show about your stakeholders and the things that they like to talk about. So that the more refined you are, the better. So in Atlanta, there's the Supply Chain Now podcast, and so all they talk about is supply chain, and all the guests are vendors or clients or potential clients and people that love talking about supply chain. They're just nerding out on supply chain all day long. So it's a great way to invite people into the community. And that way, when there's a supply chain conference, you show up, you set up a table, you have a podcasting booth, you're inviting people. Hey, Bill, come on over here and jump into the booth. Let's chat and do a mashup of some content over here. They already know you. They've been listening to the content. They've been guests on your show. So it's a great way to build relationships so that when you do show up to those events, you're already kind of in everyone's corner and they're in yours.
Yeah, I love that. It makes so much sense to, I like your rule of thumb, share who you have, not what you have. I think that's so smart because, in terms of selling, I think a lot of times people think you just have to be talking about your product all the time. And it's so hard to convince people that, you don't just because you can't necessarily measure like, okay, I spoke for 30 minutes and I got X number of sales during that time. It's not always a direct ROI, as is with a lot of marketing things. But yeah, a good way to connect with people within your industry. But yeah, all stakeholders, I suppose. So in terms of connecting with consumers, is there like certain types of podcasts that you may want to guest on, or how narrow should your audience be if you're going to be hosting your own? Because I know, if, for instance, you're looking for people who are going to, be purchasing, say, a food product or something that's like an environmentally friendly product, are you looking to create that as your whole focus, or do you want to be guesting on podcasts that are people in that target audience, or do you have any advice on that?
I'll say this is a pre-qualifier. Most of the content that I've started has been more business to business focused. And so highlighting the leaders within their business, the good work that they're doing to use business and influence as a force for good. However, what I'll say about it is if you are a B2C brand and you have a very clear idea of who your consumer is, what is their persona, what are their behaviors, what do they love to do outside of consuming your product or your service, and you start creating platforms for stories to be shared. So, I always love narrative storytelling, right? There's the hero's journey, for instance. Once you look up hero's journey online, you can never unsee it. Every story has an arc to it. And there's usually the hero, which is the person that's experienced some sort of tension in their life and some sort of a challenge. And then a hero, or a guide rather, comes into that story to help them either avoid failure or achieve success. Donald Miller is a great author of this. He has Story Brand Guide, which is a book that he wrote, and lots of content around that. There it is, Building a Story Brand.
Got it right here.
Better book.
Handy.
Yeah.
If you have not read it, I always recommend.
So that's a great read. So who are your people? Who are your people that buy your products or services? And what are their stories? And what are their challenges? How can you be their guide? And how can you not be their, try to be their hero, make them the hero of their own story, and give a platform where you're sharing stories that are relevant, that matter, that are compelling, that touch on the subjects that they keep them up at night and that they're interested in. So, we could come up with a lot of examples, right? We could just name a company and say, who are their consumers, and then start to pontificate and come up with an idea of what their consumers would like to consume. But it takes a little bit of workshopping in the beginning. But again, it just goes back to knowing who your persona buyers are and helping to share stories that are relevant to them, not just trying to market to them. Self-promotion, self-marketing, all that falls on deaf ears, particularly with Gen Z and our generations coming up behind. It's not compelling to them to just get your traditional advertising with all the noise out there.
Oh man, I hear what you're saying. And it's so in alignment with what Channing and I have been, telling our clients and the members in our community about when it comes to building a brand is like, starting out with your why, like really understanding what it is, that purpose behind what you're doing, and then looking at the people you're solving the problem for. And that's just such, I mean, we decided to call our work foundational marketing because we found that as like really the key pillars for building on anything. And whether it's a podcast or whether it's the copy for your website or whatever, because you need to be solving a problem for somebody, and you need to understand what that core message is and be able to tell a good story around it. And so, podcasting is obviously a great place to be able to tell stories and capture the audience. And I like it's just one of those, like you're talking about the hero's journey. I mean, it's just kind of a timeless thing, is that people are communicating through story. And it's the perfect venue, which is why it seems to me that podcasting is going to be around a while. It's not a fast trend. It's something that's it's capturing this tradition that's been going on since the dawn of time, really.
Yeah, and it's so important that we're thinking empathically towards our guests and our audience, the listeners to the show. And if we're making it about us and the things that are important to us, and we're just constantly going through that loop, nobody's going to care. Nobody's going to listen. But when you actually have on guests and you ask them, you help them feel comfortable and prepared, first of all, invite them onto a planning session beforehand where you can align on the details of what to expect and the questions we'll be asking and so forth. But once you arrive at their unique point of view and you know more about their story, their past, present, future, obstacles they've overcome, tensions that they've overcome, and thinking about the generational impact of them telling their story to someone that might be in that place today that they've already experienced. And you think about the fact that, hey, newsflash, we're all limited citizens here on this earth, right? We're gonna go off to heaven someday, and we're gonna leave it to this next generation. And so if we're thinking about all content that we're sharing, all stories that we're passing down for the greater good of developing our next generation and creating our sustainable future through that, then you have a great show. You have a great show where people are going to come on. Nathan probably can attest to this. We've had people tell us it's like therapy, like sharing their story and sharing their life and like stuff that people never ask them on any shows, because all they want is the 5 steps to success and, create some sort of commoditized, pithy advice that's going to be put out in the form of content. And then the audience is gonna appreciate it more. They're going to be more apt to share the content and promote it to their networks and their audience, because they're going to be more proud of the content that they did in collaboration with you, and you made it possible. And then more people are getting exposed to your brand and your podcast and the relationships that you're building in an authentic way. And so it's just, you never really have to sell anybody again, in my opinion, when you're creating good collaborative content. And nobody likes to sell, right? We don't want to sell ice to an Eskimo. They don't need it, right? So, if we really want to build a relationship with the Eskimo, let's hear their story. Let's invite them onto our show and see, how did they become an Eskimo? Was it in their family line? Was it, some childhood trauma that they overcame or experienced that made them want to live out in the cold and build an igloo and live out there? Like, I want to know the story. And if it just so happens that during that they're like, you know what, I'm tired of cultivating my own ice, so I'd like to buy yours, then so be it. But don't make that your priority. And that's the
Mhm.
first time I've ever used that analogy. So sorry if it was a little all over the place.
No, I definitely get where you're going. And I think in terms of talking about, listening to the audience and building those connections, we do have a question from one of our community members, and they were asking about podcast channels, podcast networks. And so she's looking to learn more about building this kind of channel of having your own podcast, but then also kind of tagging other podcasts to go along with it, so that you have kind of like a whole station that's based around a certain theme. Um, I don't really know too much about that. I'm wondering if you've had much experience there, or have any tips on that.
Yeah, to some degree, not a lot. So as a pre-qualifier, but I use Omni, which is a great hosting platform, omnistudio.com. If you go on their website, you can see how you can build a network.
Mm,
And I like the idea as a media entity, if you're creating a network of collaborators that all have a common thread, it's just like any major mainstream media, right? You have a network and then you have affiliates and people that collaborate, but you have kind of a central tone and tenor. Hopefully it's not too far left or too far right. And you're being a little bit more mindful of that. But yeah, there's tons of that. And there's tons of hosting platforms out there that people are using. I just so happen to use Omni because they've got great service and great um, analytics and just things that you can kind of keep an eye on things. It's super easy to use. But there's lots of platforms where you could set up a network and then bring in shows under that umbrella, and then cross promote wherever you promote, whether that's newsletters, social media. Find ways to integrate and to elevate one another, and then your network becomes the uh, like kind of the overarching brand behind the scenes, and that kind of powers all of these individual affiliates and networks. And that's kind of what I'm doing with Chat with Leaders Media, coming up on my 7th show that I'm planning since last October. And it's, getting to be a lot of fun. And for the most part, they all have very similar themes, but they focus on different areas of B2B brands. And so I have a network. All the shows are kind of going into that space, and then I'm helping to promote and to create content with them, and then create a community. Like I built a Slack channel, or a Slack workspace rather, for everybody, that everybody can come in and have access to one another. They can ask questions. Like I had someone come in the other day and say, "Hey, first time podcaster and glad to be in here." How did people feel when they started their podcast, right? Were they like overthinking it, or were they nervous about it? And like everyone chimed in with their own story. And that's great to see people coming together and to feel like they have a safe space to be vulnerable. I'm thinking about creating mastermind groups where we can gather maybe once a quarter and just share our experiences with it, what we've learned along the journey, maybe having an annual conference that we bring creators and leaders together within your network. So if you're going to create a community, make sure you're doing it with the intent to really pour in and treat your network like a family. And I think that's where people will really want to stick around for a long time. It'll keep the retention rate, for the lack of a better phrase, strong.
mhm. Awesome. So before we run out of time, I want to get some maybe more specific details for people who are looking to start a podcast, or maybe have started one and are not sure how to continue with it or keep it up. So what's kind of some items that you might refer to in terms of how frequently they should be putting out a podcast, and what kind of metrics are they looking to track?
Yeah. So let's talk about frequency first. I think that you don't really want to do it too infrequently. Like I don't think a monthly podcast for a first time podcaster that's not a celebrity. If you're a celebrity, drop once a year, you'll probably get
Give
a ton of
everyone
downloads,
one.
right? But if you're just an everyday ordinary person like I am, then I would recommend trying to get content out as quickly as you can, because the way you're monetizing it and the way you're making it sustainable is that you're creating relationships with your guests and your audience. And so if you can get it out on a weekly cadence regularly on the same day of the week and same general time, and you create a system for yourself, like I use Trello to track all of my production and when things go out, and when things are scheduled, so that I can just keep things orderly and organized. And then commit to that and say, I'm going to do it, and maybe evaluate after season one, which maybe season one's like 10 episodes or 20 episodes, whatever your goal is. I just kept going. I never did a season, or I did 100+ episodes and just kept going, weekly, and only took a break around the election. So that, or if you don't have a margin, do it bi-weekly, start there. And if you can accelerate the pace as you go, do that, but try to be consistent. People say consistency is key. Doesn't mean it's going to be the end of the world if you miss a day or something, but people are starting to expect a certain cadence and release of content. Then it's best to try to build your process, your team, or your own individual involvement in all the things that you need to do to drop a podcast, so that you can meet those dates. And then in terms of analytics, you asked about that. If you have a good hosting platform like Omni, for instance, Omni Studio, or Anchor is another one that is advertised as free, but of course I think there's advertisers and stuff like that people that can get in the door with you hosting on their platform. But those are two of the top ones right now, and there's several. Libsyn is another one. They'll give you consumption analytics like downloads, listeners, what devices they're downloading on or listening on, what directory, if it's an Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, just so you have a general idea where geographically people are tuning in. And you hope that if you're geographically focused on a community, that it's mostly in your neck of the woods. Like I'm kind of focused on Atlanta, and most of my guests are in the Atlanta metro area, with some exceptions. So that's usually where all my listeners come from. And then you can go to the third-party directories that you're syndicating it out to, like the Apple Podcasts and the Spotify's, and look in their back-end admin sites, how many subscribers and all that. But honestly, I would encourage people not to get too caught up early in the vanity metrics, particularly because it's hard. And if you're measuring your success solely on that, primarily, audience growth is important. I'm not dismissing it, but make it kind of more of a tertiary goal down the line, and commit to a certain length of time. Like I'm going to do bi-weekly podcast for 6 months, and then I'm going to evaluate. During that 6 months, I'm going to be very refined and focused on interviewing a certain type of guest persona. And I may structure topics that are a central theme to the overarching premise of the show, but each episode has its own story arc, with the individual guest that we arrive at together in a planning call. And then look back and say, am I achieving some goals? And if it's a business to business or even business to consumer, it's always hard to do attribution modeling and marketing and say where exactly are people coming from? And I want to measure ROI for all these initiatives. You should aspire to know that stuff, but just ask your people, ask all your customers, hey, have you listened to my podcast, or have you heard any of the stories, or what is your feedback? And what do you think about it? And if they haven't, then you're informing them that there is one, and maybe they'll start and share that with others. But sometimes you just got to ask the people that you're working with, instead of just saying how did you hear about us, and then do a drop down list of oh, it was from pay-per-click, or it was from an email or something like that. It doesn't work. It's not a drop down. It's a lot of everything. But the more content you have out there swirling around, being shared by your guests and reshared by your listeners, and the more they're signing up for your newsletters and engaging with your brand because they like what you're putting out there, you'll see that momentum, you'll see that growth. And it's kind of like this innate thing. You realize all of a sudden it's oh my gosh, I've got a great network, and I've got great friendships that I'm developing through this. I told my wife I went to a gala recently, and I'm hugging executives and people that I know, and I know about their kids. I'm praying for them, they're praying for me. I know them way more intimately than I ever would have known them, and I probably would have had no other reason to know them had I not created a platform to invite them on my show. And it's a great way to build audience, and you'll see the success that comes with that as you build that community.
That's amazing. And there are probably people you hadn't met in person before, right?
Correct. Yeah, because I started at the beginning of the pandemic. So a lot of these relationships where people are lamenting over not having friendships and personal connections being gained during the pandemic, I feel like I've never had a stronger network because we're just being intentional about the way we connect and listen to one another and share stories and just know a little bit more in depth versus just always trying to transact business or strive for the wrong things. You know, strive for the relationships. The success will always follow if you pour in and you want to be the person that adds value to other people's lives. That success, again, it'll follow.
Amazing. Well, I have loved this conversation, and I'm sure that people have gotten a lot of value from it. Is there any other questions that we have from people that joined us here? Or Channing, was there anything else we had to ask?
Well, I can chime in. I'm curious about, maybe what the path looks like to starting your own podcast. If people are curious about starting a podcast, but we work with a lot of really small companies and they don't necessarily have the bandwidth to allocate towards starting their own podcast. Do you recommend, or do you see them maybe starting kind of the concept on Instagram stories? Or you mentioned recording a lot of the conferences or a lot of the things that they do and then putting that on LinkedIn, or what does that look like as far as a build up to launching their own podcast?
Yeah, I think if you're comfortable in your own skin, your own voice, and you're able to put yourself out there, I mean, some of the live stuff that you're doing, like Instagram Live or doing just web conferences, community gatherings, showing up and speaking and evangelizing your content that way is a little bit more comfortable way and doesn't require all the post production and the polish that you want to put into it. You're not layering in theme music or pre-roll, post-roll, mid-roll, all this stuff that goes into it. But yeah, just start there and start, showing up in the places that people that you want to serve and get, do business with and pour into, that they show up and speak and participate, and don't just be the fly on the wall, right? Listening in and it's okay. I mean, be curious, want to learn and all that stuff. But the more if your desire is to be a creator, then just go out there and create some content and record it. So, and then you'll get more and more comfortable and you'll see the momentum being gained from that.
Very cool.
JVN.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Just a quick
You have good
question.
etiquette with your digital hand raise. I like that, man. You're a pro.
Thank
You
you.
must have done a Zoom call or two.
I'm happy to hear that. And then there's the phone going off.
Of course, right on time.
I was wondering, you mentioned something about agencies, like access more interviews through agencies.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have recommendations of such agencies that you find very valuable?
For booking speakers, like for you to be agencies where they can book you as a speaker on various podcasts?
Yes, correct. Mm-hmm.
What was the one I heard of recently? I have not used one myself, but let me see if I can find it real quick. There was one up in Boston that I heard from a trusted source the other day that was good. Agency in Boston. Let me see. And there's so many. I don't know if it's
we've also
expert
used one,
Interview Connections. I think it was Interview Connections was the one that they said they really liked. And there's lots of them. I mean, it's maybe even something I should get in. It seems like a lot of people are trying to do it these days, but it's a matter of finding the right agent, the right person that understands your voice and it's going to be respectful in their outreach and that's going to be mindful of really connecting the dots and being intentional about getting you to the right people. There's also a website called Podmatch. Isn't that what that's called, Nathan, that you've used before? Podmatch is a website where you can go on and I think, what do? You build your profile and kind of your voice and maybe a speaker sheet, and then the algorithm matches you up to podcasts that use similar keywords and talk about the same
you put
subjects.
tags just like you would for like an Eventbrite. You put tags of like what you speak about, and then it'll match you up with sustainability, conscious capitalism. There's even a B Corp tag, and then So, and it's like 39 bucks a month. You get 6 matches every 24 hours. I ran out of matches for about a day and then I had new matches. So,
Yeah.
so yeah, but it's pretty easy. And I booked, I think like 20 last year. So,
Yep. You were speaking on a lot. And I think the more you get out there and share that, the more comfortable you are, and the more you'll see the different experiences that various podcast shows and hosts will give you, and the things that you like, the things that you don't like. And if you're thinking about starting your own, but you want to start as a guest, then that's a great way to evaluate those things. And then eventually say, going back to your question earlier, Channing, like now I feel a little bit more equipped on how to manage that and how to create a great guest experience on our show. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, definitely. Oh.
Yeah.
Awesome. Are you looking to speak on more podcasts?
I would say yes, mainly because I mean, like the product that I'm creating or working to bring to market is such a new product
Mm-hmm.
that if I really was to start a project around specifically this product, which I do have an audience around this product, but it wouldn't necessarily be the same audience that would be trying to reach in the natural food space as much. So
Yeah.
maybe getting out there and just like, talk to people about there's this thing called breadfruit. Why is this valuable and all this kind of stuff might
Mhm.
just be a good way to help to penetrate the market, and then I could eventually get back to this space and
Yeah.
create my own platform.
Definitely connect with Nathan and talk about it more, because I think ultimately you could go either one of those routes, and it's a matter of how much margin of time you have. If it's pod match and you're kind of managing the outreach and the bookings and the requests and everything, an agent, which would probably cost you more, would be responsible for that solely, and maybe take the heavy lifting off your plate. So it's just a matter of evaluating your time, your motives, and aligning with the right people. That'd be my best advice. But I think getting out there and speaking about a new product and your why, your purpose, and your story is the best thing you can do. And remember, the people are the brand, the who, not the what sometimes, and the story behind the product, and just like really try to nail that down, and how you want to share that story over and over again. And I'm sure it'll resonate. If you're hanging out with Kate and Channing and this crew, then I know you've got a really solid why.
That's good to hear.
Well, and you
yes,
have a good point about the education too, JP. And I think a lot of companies are in that situation, because it's like when you're doing things purposely and you're, selecting your, employees and your suppliers and all these third parties that you're working with. Maybe you're trying to work with B Corps. I mean, when you're taking the time to do that and sourcing organically, like you really need to be able to educate your consumers about how you're doing that, why you're doing it, and what that translates to for them. So education is definitely a big part of telling that story.
You brought up a really good point about talent too, right? The more content you have out there, the more authentically you're out there sharing your story, the more people are going to want to work for you and be part of that if they feel in alignment with that, versus the surface level, like researching your website and looking for the basics of just what you do, right? But the why you do it, and how that bleeds into culture and purpose and meaning and impact. That's where a lot of talent or job seekers, particular career seekers, are more so vetting. And so the more you're out there sharing your story and then housing that content on your website, and that's you're going to have more opportunities to grow in your suppliers and your stakeholder relationships, whether it's customers, suppliers, community, people, all of that.
Awesome. I feel like we could talk about this forever, but I know everybody's got places to be today. So I wanted to get it wrapped up. But Jeff, thank you so much for coming in. And is there, if there's people that have more questions, is there a way for them to reach out to you?
Yeah, you could shoot me a text, 678-827-3635. You could email me at jeff@chatwithleaders.com, or go on the website, chatwithleaders.com, check it out, see what you like, see questions you have, and then reach out. Happy to chat, and always love talking about podcasting content and being a conscious business leader in this fallen world that we live in, and how we can use our influence in business as a force for good.
Love it. Thank you so much. And thank you all for coming. I hope this was a valuable session for you. And for those listening to the recording, if you have further questions, reach out to Jeff, reach out to Channing or I. We're happy to connect you. We love building this community and, helping you as much as we can. So thanks again, everyone.
It's a pleasure. Have a great day, y'all.